So let's talk about what happens when you feel bad beforehand. You believe you have BII and you take the implant out. I've seen patients get better and then I may not ever see them again. And my experience has been with breast augmentation patients, if they're happy, they don't come back. If you take the implants out and they're happy, they don't come back. We haven't got a big tracking mechanism. So what are you seeing? What are you seeing as advocates? What are you hearing from women? What, do all of them get better? Do 75% of them get better? What's your feeling? We don't have good numbers. Yes, is our problem.
You know, the literature actually says around 70 to 80% get better. And if they have a diagnosed autoimmune disease, those people are less likely to improve. Although even in functional medicine, we are seeing some reversal in autoimmune diseases, especially things, the gateway autoimmune disease, Hashimoto's, that Jamie was talking about. We will see reversal in that, and that seems to be induced from toxicity, a lot of toxicity or inflammation. And you know, I think it is important that we do figure out a way to determine who will benefit from getting their implants out and who won't. And that's just a question that I think that we don't have the answer to. When we see all of these symptoms and their toxicity symptoms, is it the implants or is it something else? And if we as a group of physicians and advocates can put together a set of questions, even, you know,
a question before surgery, after surgery,
help, you know, determine what things do get better, what things don't.
Which symptoms will get better and which ones don't.
And what percent? You know, if I could sit down with a patient who's exhausted every other avenue and says, I got to try taking out my implants, if I could say, okay, 75% of people appear to have their brain fog improves, their weakness improves, they feel better.
I wanted to comment also on something we were talking about earlier, which is which patients seem to have more problems with this. And there is some evidence that people with a lot of allergies that tend to just develop allergies for whatever reason. As a child, they had, you know, asthma or, you know, some other immune condition. Those women seem to be more likely to come down with this illness, and just some of the papers that I've reviewed. So. That is one thing.
There was a Canadian study from, I think, in the early 2000s where they had a large number of women had implant removal, and what was the outcome after removal. And there were three groups that this was divided to. One is women who had symptoms but no abnormal laboratories, nothing. The second group were patients who were diagnosed with some sort of rheumatologic disease but didn't have any laboratory, ANA was not elevated. The third ones were people with full-blown positive ANA, full-blown rheumatologic or autoimmune disease. The patients who had no abnormal labs but symptoms, 80% of those patients got better. The patients who were in that middle group who, you know, may have had a diagnosis but not hard and fast, they would temporarily get better, then their symptoms recur. Patients with full-blown autoimmune diseases did not show improvement from removing their implants.
I can see that. See, and we were talking about this before filming, but I don't believe that the implants are necessarily the cause as much as the trigger. Like, I may have had been prone to autoimmune disease, perhaps it wouldn't have developed till later on in life, but this was maybe the trigger that triggered my autoimmune disease. Well, by the time I had my implants out, I had had Hashimoto's for, gosh, 15 years. So my Hashimoto's symptoms did not reverse, but I have seen it reverse in the women who have caught it early. So it does lead me to question, had I caught this early, could I have reversed my Hashimoto's?
Would that have changed?
Yeah. And we do have a project behind the scenes going on that should be launched very soon that will hopefully be looking at what symptoms were present before, what's gone away, birth defects, things like that we haven't really addressed before, because from our standpoint, what's being missed is, well, first of all, a lot of the studies focused on silicone gel, and I had saline. I didn't have silicone gel.
Most of the ones we see are saline.
Yeah, so I think that's a big part that we're missing is, and
we just weren't looking at saline implants,
and maybe
at
not
all.
And they weren't studied like the gel was. Yeah, so that's actually interesting.
We actually see pretty even numbers between silicone and saline. And I think that that's a big part that we've missed out on the studies. First of all, you know, a lot of the studies that got the implants back on the market were prior to 1999. So we're dealing with a lot of different things now, but we didn't look at the saline patients. We didn't look at patients who'd had their implants longer than 10 years. We looked at defined connective tissue disease as opposed to symptoms. And so I really think we have to start over. I mean, there's a lot that we did not take into consideration with these first studies. And I would like to personally see a comparison of silicone and patients with silicone and saline breast implants in comparison with patients who have no implantable devices. Because we do work with, we work collaboratively with other implantable device patients who have symptoms very similar to ours. So I think we actually have to step back and compare that to a population that doesn't have anything implanted.
There have been studies done. There was a study done by MD Anderson where they had breast reconstruction patients who were actually randomized into studies of either autologous reconstruction or implant reconstruction, and there were patients it was a control group who decided not to have reconstruction, and they checked ANA levels on those patients, and the control group had the highest number of abnormal ANAs over the autologous versus the implant-based patients, which is really an interesting thing. Then they went back, women who had implants, women who had ruptured implants and no implants, who had the highest abnormal ANA levels, and again, it was the control group. It was like, and it wasn't like a lot more, it was like 26 versus 24 versus 22. So that's where it gets very difficult. You know, they went back there was a study where they followed nurses forever, and I forget how many, like 80,000 patients in that study, and they went back and said, 11,000 of them had implants. What percentage had autoimmune disease? But again, not symptoms, diagnosed diseases.
Yes.
Exactly.
And
we're not
that's
looking
where the
at
National Institute of Health study came in, and it was the same. If you have 1 million women with implants and 1 million women who don't have implants, the same number had diagnosed autoimmune diseases. The interesting question that you bring up is they didn't ask about symptoms. And it may be like, oh, you're old ladies, who cares what your symptoms are.
And as
but
you
that's
said,
a very interesting point.
If it didn't cause your Hashimoto's, but it triggered it. So that goes along with the argument of why there wasn't a big difference in autoimmune diseases with implants and without, because not necessarily cause and effect, but a trigger to put you down that road sooner. And we just haven't asked the questions.
And some of the studies also only looked at hospitalizations. They didn't look at women just in the general population with connective tissue disease. But I do think we're missing out on a lot. I think we did like an informal poll in our groups, and there was 83%. Now, of course, we're looking at the sick women here. We're not looking at the general population, but 83% had developed a diagnosed autoimmune disease after their implants. And I feel like we have to really study the sick patients. We have to figure out, is there this common denominator? Is there a genetic predisposition? Is there a family history of autoimmune disease? Because as you guys know, even the implant manufacturers will say they haven't studied the long-term effects in patients who have a known autoimmune disease. They don't know the outcome of that.
Yeah, I've seen some studies that say the MTHFR abnormality has been associated because it's detoxifying. It helps the liver to detoxify things. That are those patients at higher risk. I've seen that mentioned in some of the groups.
There's a large number of our patients who have the MTHFR genetic.
Yeah, I've been testing all
mutation.
of my breast implant illness patients for it, and we've not seen a higher number than expected, but I think it's more common than we know.
Yeah.
though,
And
too.
again, it was something that wasn't even around 20
Right.
years ago.
Right, yeah, right.
We didn't know about MTHFR.
There's
I
so
think the
many
other one,
detox genes,
HLA
other
27.
than
Yeah, that's the other
MTHFR
right.
too.
FDA. The FDA, you ladies have been to the FDA several times. How can we, as plastic surgeons, and you as patients and patient advocates, work together with the FDA, work with the FDA, together and apart? What are your thoughts?
I think we're still trying to figure that out. But Jamie and I have been there since the beginning. Our first meeting was 3 advocates, correct? Our next meeting we had 5, and the last time we met in September of last year, there were 25 of us, 5 countries represented. And we have been persistent. Jamie has been great and persistent in saying, we need a voice. We need to come to the table. We still push, why the ASAP is not there. You know, we bring that up every time, and it doesn't make, you know, we need everybody coming to the table, the patients, the advocates, we need physicians, we need your group to come, and then we need the pharmaceutical companies. But it needs to be a collaborative effort, and we think we're getting somewhere. We're finally having our public hearing at the end of March, but we still have a long ways to go.
Yeah.
But we don't even know if the American Society for Aesthetic Plastic Surgeon or American Society of Plastic Surgeons is even going to have a seat at the table.
I know.
And that's who represents us as physicians. And you know, even in the FDA studies, it has nothing to do with what we say as physicians as these studies are designed. We try and say, you know, we would like, these are things we think need to be done. The FDA says, no, we want a patient diary every day. We're like, well, we don't want a patient diary. We want, you know, every day for 10 years because they're not going to do it. We want testing done. We want the study to go for 10 years and not let them quit once you give them approval for all that. But they, as physicians, we kind of feel powerless as well. It seems like whoever has the most money gets the big seats at the table, and we're sometimes left out when our goal is to help our patients.
And we bring that up every time because we've kind of felt the same way too. The TUF study was
Funded by
industry, and it wasn't a great representation that we felt it needed to be. And you go back and kind of look historically, that's what continued, the people with the most money are what gets brought to the table. Previous FDA hearings, prior to when we came in, it was kind of the same thing. There wasn't a great voice for a patient advocate. There was always some kind of tie. So I think it's something that we need to continue to work on. And we've been successful because we're going on our 4th time in the past 3 years. But we keep on pushing. But every time we've gone, we've asked for that. We really have.
Or it'll be anecdotal. That's the other thing is I'll have people come up, well, you know, my Aunt Sally had implants and she had silicone oozing out of her eyeballs. Like, well, no, that couldn't happen. You know, and we need to have doctors. And, you know, industry and pharmaceutical companies, we can say they're terrible, but they're the ones who do, you know, why does industry fund a lot of our breast implant studies? Because we can't afford to do it.
We had that
you know?
exact
We have-
conversation.
yes, we have.
And they're not, I work with the implant companies, you know, they're not evil. They really do want to help the patients. They really do want to. But, you know, we all have to look at, honestly, at what are our motives.
And it's checks
what
and
are
balances.
Our biases and stuff.
That's right. And it's checks and balances. And by having patients there, by having industry there, by having plastic surgeons there, and the FDA there, we should all be able to keep each other in balance, check and balance what's important, what's not. Oh, you're not looking at this. I know you don't want to look at this, but you really do need to look at this.
I question how much. I don't mean this to sound horrible, but we've said before that there's a large subset of doctors who are just uninformed. Like on the adverse event reports, are you doctors aware that this data had been hidden for years? Are you aware that the percentage of adverse event reports that are filed to MOD is just a very, very small portion of what it represents, like 14%? You know, when we came out with the Associated Press article a few months ago, you know, last year we saw the numbers jump up, and I wrote the FDA and said, why did this happen? And at first they said, was a change in reporting practices. So it does make me curious to see,
which
are
means
the
we
surgeons
were
aware?
underreporting for years, and so it makes it look all of a sudden they're dangerous. No, we weren't just were just batching our reports.
They kind of said no, the numbers haven't increased, but it's the numbers have been there all along. They were hidden. But when you as a surgeon are going to implant a device and you want to know about this device and you want to know about the safety of it, and you go to the MOD database, which first of all is not very easy to maneuver.
Yeah, it's not.
You're not getting accurate data. So as a surgeon, how does that affect you when you're trying to make decisions about the products you're using and you can't get accurate data on that device?
I think most of us rely on like ASAPS and ASPS to help us sift through the information as the societies and the organizations, because industry will put a paper right in front of you and show you whatever their kind of slanted view of it is. You go to the MOD database, to your point, you got to figure out where you're at on there, and I can tell you most practitioners are not going to the MAUD database because they don't know how to manipulate it, and it influences too
can't.
much. So we've got to be educated. We've got to stay educated ourselves. We've got to read our journals. We've got to go to our meetings, and we've got to listen to our patients.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's a peer-reviewed, papers that are
Not funded by industry.
right.
Yeah.
Well, but even
they
some of the
can be.
industry-funded
That's
papers
right.
have been. I mean, you had an
Still
industry-funded
peer-reviewed.
paper that was
Absolutely.
very good recently on pocket irrigation and all, and that's sometimes we can't do it without it, but. I'm a reviewer, Minnie's a reviewer for the journals, and we get these papers. Some of you look at them like, okay, this is ridiculous. Doesn't think, but a peer-reviewed paper where we really look at these things very carefully in the good journals. Now, I get, because I've had papers published, Minnie's had papers published, every day I get 100 emails from the Journal of Obscure something or this or that. They want you to submit a paper. So you can find anything you want if you look up papers, but you really want to go to the the good journals that are peer-reviewed, that are really, that are really carefully vetted papers before they come out.
Well, we did have there was a supplement this week that came out on like 8 papers on
ASJ, yeah,
ALCL.
right.
And we did get some pushback. We got some kind of ugly comments. These were all funded by industry. And we did say there wouldn't be any
There'd be no
research on
studies.
ALCL if it wasn't for industry. So while, I do have a biased opinion about a lot of it, I can't sit there and argue that fact. It is industry funding this research, and we wouldn't
who's
have
going
it
to
if
pay
it
for those
wasn't.
lab
Right.
tests?
Right.
The surgeon, the
So-
patient. The patient's busy trying to pay for their cancer surgery. They're not going to pay for the laboratory test to track this out.
But I do think there's some pitfalls in what surgeons know. I mean, if you can't, just from what I've seen, there's a high rupture rate. I don't even know what it is. Style 68 it's a saline implant, I think. There's a lot of adverse event reports for that. And so it does make me curious whether you guys are getting
Well, I mean,
getting
the
that
risk
data.
that an implant will rupture is 100%. If you live long enough and you do not at some point change that implant out, it's going to rupture.
Yeah.
So the question is, what's the consequence of that rupture, and how are you going to know about it? And that's why we got the high resolution ultrasound, because you have a gel implant that's leaking, and rupture sounds like it's exploding, so I kind of hate to say that. And with the newer gels, the gels hold together. It's not like what we had. I took out 30-year-old implants last month, and it was like
You could pour
oil.
it.
Yeah.
It's like
Yeah.
maple syrup.
That's much more of a consequence, because that does go into the lymph nodes. With some of
Migrates
the
and
newer
lymph nodes.
implants, you take them out. It's nice. They come out in one piece. So but the chance your implant is going to rupture is 100%. But you have to follow up. You have to be checked, and have to know what to do about it. Now, saline implants, some people think, well, it's good because when they deflate, because you knew
you
when
got a
yours
check
had
valve
deflated.
right there.
And there are people who are pushing this now is that, oh no, you want a saline implant rupture. Well, you want the best implant for you. And you want to talk to a surgeon who's not pushing one brand or one type of implant and tells you, listen, if I like textured implants because they stay where you put them, they look good for a long time, but I stopped using them after the ALCL. I tell the patients, until this is sorted out, I'm staying away from this because all what we do is all elective. But what's the best thing for you? And just all of your options. If someone comes in and just gives you one option, that's a red flag.
And the nice thing is, and it is a red flag, because implants have changed so much in the last 10 years, what has become available. It kind of has pushed us to stay up with what the latest science is, because you want to be offering the top of the line product, whatever that is, whether it's skincare, a breast implant, the best liposuction. So that, in a way, keeps plastic surgeons coming to the meetings. What's the newest? What's the best? Well, who's saying this is best? What are the studies to support that? What do patients look like with that done? So that does help.
I think with BII, how can we report the symptoms if we haven't created a list
Yeah.
of
A
symptoms?
list of symptoms, a questionnaire.
To report. And
Exactly.
so it's really, I would say at this point, I would imagine hardly anyone is reporting any kind of BII symptoms because
Well, the problem is there's so many of them.
Yes.
Yeah,
It would be
that too,
much easier if
that
it was
too.
3 things that everybody had, but it's so many different
It's
things
so
it makes
many.
it very difficult to put that
To
puzzle
your
together.
point, we've been talking because both she and I see BII patients, but we're not, we have friends and colleagues who are seeing 150, 200 a year. And you found one who was doing before and after questionnaires. Everybody else is just busy operating,
so
trying to
important.
take, but they're trying to take good care of their patients, and they're not thinking, and they're like, oh yeah, I wish I'd been doing that.
There's a few. I know there's
kinda
3
get
or 4
blinded.
here in
Marissa
Dallas.
Lawrence, I know, does.
There's
on all
one here
kinds
in
of stuff.
Dallas that's following up, and that's, I don't know how to recommend that. I thought there was an ASPS recommendation put out recently.
Well, that's what we're working on for
yeah,
our task force, is to come
that
up
was
with
making
these.
a questionnaire recommendation,
Yes.
and I think that's important. And the project we're working on hopefully will give data to researchers about the top common symptoms.
Yeah.
But
Which would be
it's-
great.
Yeah,
that
that
would
would
be
very
That would
useful.
be.
But it's
huge.
not a defined disease. I mean, BIA ALCL has a designation, BII does not, and
And that's been our journey with the FDA.
Yeah.
We didn't come in with BII. We opened the door with BIA ALCL. And our first meeting was all about that. The second meeting was all about that. Every time we went to the table with them, we did push for additional things. And by our third meeting, we had 5 women with ALCL and 20 women with BII. And now we're opening the next meeting for, so it hasn't been defined for BII, but talking with the FDA, ALCL opened up the door to start having more of this conversation. So I think there needs to be some
Well, it's an
protocol.
It's a
immune
lot
system.
harder to.
It is.
I was thinking of going back to all my BII patients and say, at least how many of you got better? You know,
Yeah.
what did we
we
write?
don't even
They
have
write
that.
their
Great.
symptoms down. I'm going to go back and what got better, what didn't get better. I had one patient who had her implants removed. She came back in 2 years later and she said, I'm not any better. I'd like my implants replaced. If I'm going to feel bad, I might as well look good.
and we've seen women
we
do
have
that.
seen that,
And,
yes.
and I will say that we don't.
And if you had a percentage that you
go.
could say, 75% get better, 80% get
I'd
better.
like to
With
know,
the widths, we
which
don't
ones
have it.
get better? Does the brain fog get better? Does
Right.
the joint pain get better? Do we need to send them to somebody like you that can look at other things that may be going on?
Do
Yeah.
they get better, but it takes 6 months? Or if you're not better in 2 weeks, that's it.
There's
That's
a
what
lot
you're
of
gonna get.
frustration with the patient. I mean,
I think
they're-
it's all going to be so individual,
Yeah.
honestly.
That's
I
what
mean,
makes it so hard to make the
does.
diagnosis.
we all
and, yeah.
have different life paths and different abilities to get rid of these things, different amounts of other things that may be causing us
Right,
problems.
right.
And how much is that breast implant contributing to the overall picture and
and we
teasing that
try
out?
to be
you know.
realistic. Like we're not ones to sit there and say your hangnail is from your implants.
Yeah.
There are some that believe every single problem they have is
Right.
from their implants, and there's nothing we can do personally to change those thoughts. But if you've exhausted all your other means and you've gotten to that point of desperation, I know you were saying you don't want to push a patient into immediate removal at 6 weeks after their implants have been placed, but I don't know what that gray area
Yeah.
is. But I do think that once a patient's exhausted those means and they've gotten to the point where they don't care what they're going to look like after, absolutely these
You've
surgeons
checked
should
other
be
things.
doing what.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so you have to rule out that you're not missing something else for it.